الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah, welcome to another reading from our newest publication, Blended Families, an Islamic Approach to unconventional family structures. Today, inshallah ta'ala, just take a few moments before Salatul Dhuhr and read through one of the chapters in the book. This is chapter number 2. And chapter number 2 is called The Culture of Divorce, the Rule, Not the Exception. The Culture of Divorce, the Rule, Not the Exception. So I'll begin with reading just a little bit from the beginning of the chapter, Jazakallah khair, from the beginning of the chapter, and then I'll move on to towards the ending of the chapter where we talk about why divorce is so prevalent in our communities today. So on page 23, it reads, after keen observation, one will notice that only one of Prophet Muhammad's wives was a divorcee, and she was Zainab bint Jahsh. Zainab was married to Zayd ibn Haritha for a short period of time before they separated. She was the only woman that the Prophet ﷺ married that was divorced previously. The rest of the Prophet ﷺ's wives were widows, with the exception of Aisha, but none of them were divorced prior to marrying him. We can conclude from this that the pre-Islamic Arabia did not have a culture that was accustomed to divorce, separation in the sense. Obviously, there was an abuse of the word divorce. There was an abuse of it. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala restricted divorce to 2 times. Allah says in the Quran, الطلاق مرتان فإمساك بمعروف أو تسريح بإحسان. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that talaq, divorce, is 2 times. Divorce is 2 times. And then you either take her back in kindness or you let her go in kindness. That was to put restrictions around the number of times a man could pronounce divorce. But as far as a man separating from the woman, as far as a man separating from a woman, there was no previous, or there was no premise to that. All right, so at the beginning of this chapter, I'm talking about why divorce was is so rampant amongst American Muslim communities today, and in the past, in the early Islamic community, it was not necessarily as bad as it is today. Similarly, in the 38 years since the Prophet ﷺ's first marriage to Khadija bint Khuwaylid, the Prophet ﷺ only divorced one of his wives. The Prophet ﷺ only divorced, out of all of the women that he had was married to previously, he only ever divorced one of his wives, and that was Hafsa, the daughter of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. However, Angel Jibreel commanded the Prophet ﷺ on instruction from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take Hafsa back, because she was consistent in voluntary fasting and during the day and prayer during the night. She was Sawama Qawama. Sawama Qawama. So Jibreel ordered the Prophet ﷺ to take her back. Alright? A principle that is consistent with the Prophet ﷺ's own saying. The Prophet ﷺ himself, he said that لا يفرق مؤمن مؤمنا إذا كره منها خلقا ورضي منها آخر, that no believing male should hate a believing female, that if he dislikes one thing about her, then let him look again and he can find something that he does like about her. Alright, so although, as Umar concluded that, the Prophet ﷺ divorcing Hafsa was as a result of her character being similar to his own. Right? He said, I don't see that the Prophet ﷺ divorced Hafsa, except that her character is just like her father's. Her character is just like her father's. Alright? And she was very straightforward at times. and unyielding at others. All right? So this was, the Prophet ﷺ divorcing one wife, throughout the whole duration of a 38-year period. So showing you that divorce wasn't prevalent. In a 38-year span, he only divorced one woman in the span of 38 years. In our communities, we may have brothers, so-called learned brothers, who will divorce, 2 or 3 times within a year. Within 1 year. And in the Islamic community, it's not uncommon for a brother, whether he is a student of knowledge or a layperson from amongst the Muslims, to divorce, multiple times within a year or 2 year span. Meanwhile, the Prophet ﷺ was in a 38-year period, he only divorced one wife. And even her, he took her back. And what I'm trying to paint here is an image of to show us that divorce was not as common and prevalent in the early Islamic community as it is today. All right? So perhaps divorce was very minimal in the early Islamic community due to the fact that it was frowned upon culturally, despite new Islamic legislation that allowed it. That although Islam allowed divorce, prior to Islam, in the Christian tradition or in the Catholic tradition, even till today, divorce is not allowed, and in many instances, it is actually frowned upon. Frowned upon. In some Arab cultures, if a woman is divorced, she runs the risk of never getting married again. In some Arab cultures, that women, in East Indian culture as well, that women run the risk that if they are divorced, they will most likely never get married again. For the most part. If she does get married, perhaps it'll be someone from outside their culture, but not someone that comes from a, prestigious lineage or prestigious family, status in the community. They're not going to marry her. Because divorce, all the way up until now, was considered something that was frowned upon. Taboo. We don't get divorced. Whereas in our communities, in the American community, and more specific, the African American Muslim community, divorce is commonplace. Divorce is commonplace. All right? So perhaps divorce was very minimal in the early Islamic community due to the fact that it was frowned upon culturally, despite new Islamic legislation that allowed it. Although Islam came and, allowed divorce for, reasons that, we can read about in, Islamic texts, why divorce is allowed. If the relationship between the husband and wife becomes toxic and they cannot maintain the limits that have been set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then divorce is mubah. It is allowed. And in some instances, it may be wajib. In some instances, it may be mustahab. It may be recommended. All right, but the general rule of talaq, of divorce, is that it is allowed. It is mubah, given the right circumstance. All right, so there are a number of factors that contributed to divorce being exception to the rule and not the rule. In the Islamic community, in the early Islamic community, divorce was considered an exception to the rule, not the rule. So we want to take a look at some of the reasons. So let's take a look today at some of the reasons why divorce was so minimum in the early Islamic community. Number one is because the Prophet ﷺ's mission was predicated on building the model Islamic community, which provided the blueprint upon which later generations would be able to navigate their challenges. So if the first Islamic community was saturated with divorce, separation, fragmented families, and that was supposed to be the blueprint for the latter generation of the Muslim communities, then what would we have to build upon? We would have nothing but dysfunction to build upon. So there was an extra push, because the Prophet ﷺ's community was supposed to be the model Islamic community. There was an additional push to be righteous and to maintain a strong family unit, strong family structure, because that would contribute to a strong community. All right? So this responsibility provided families during that time with a common struggle. Operative phrase. Common struggle. So families in the early Islamic community during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and after, right? Families had a common struggle, and the common struggle was to make sure that they laid a solid foundation for the latter generation of the Muslims that were to come. Knowing that the Muslims that were going to come later on were not going to have a prophet, there was not going to be another prophet, were not going to receive another book. The only thing that they would have is the legacy that the Sahaba and the Tabi'un and the Atba' Tabi'in left behind. That's all they would have. And that's all that we have today. There's no prophet amongst us. There is no prophet. We don't have any new legislation divine legislation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All we have is the legacy that was left behind by the first, second, and third generation of the Muslim community. That's all we have. And we're building our entire communities based upon the legacy that these communities, these early generation of the Muslim community, that they left behind. So they worked diligently to make sure that they gave an adequate representation of Islam so that the next generation would have something to build upon. And that speaks volumes for where we are right now. What are we leaving behind? It's almost as if we only concentrate on the current. We concentrate on right now. We concentrate on what is right now. Not thinking about what our children, our great-grandchildren, what do they have to build upon? What are we leaving behind for our children and our great-great-grandchildren to build upon? Not much. Not much. And this is more so for the African American Muslim community. Go to the inner cities of any, state. Go to the inner cities, the ghettos, the inner cities of any state, and you will find a dilapidated building. You will find, a rundown storefront, and these are what we consider masajid for African American converts, African American Muslims, for the most part. And there is no structure. Most of these buildings are rented buildings. Most of these properties are rented properties. And if we do own them, then, there's so much debt, that is owed on the property, and then, of course, where are the Islamic libraries, replete with, texts in Arabic and in English. Where are the, institutions, the Tahfidh al-Quran, students of knowledge that are, producing material of their own that is relative to the environments that they live in and the people that they serve. This is the legacy that we are leaving behind for 3, 4, 5 generations from now. But our concern is right now. Our concern is not 100 years from now, 70 years from now, when we are dead and gone, and our grandchildren are adults coming into adulthood. What are we leaving behind? A foundation that we are leaving behind for them. This was the concern of the Prophet ﷺ and his community, which was why, issues like divorce, social issues like divorce was not prevalent amongst them as it is amongst us today. This responsibility provided families during that time with a common struggle. We don't have a common struggle. We have individual struggles. And that's the difference between the Sahaba and the early generations of Islam versus our current societies. Our current communities, we concentrate on our own individual struggles. Whether that is financial, whether that is mental or emotional, familial, educational, it doesn't matter. Whatever struggle we have as an individual, that takes precedence and overshadows every other struggle. Because nothing else is important to us as a family or as a community except our own individual struggle. Whereas the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, they had a collective struggle. And that was to leave behind a legacy that latter generations of the Muslim community would be able to build upon. If you guys understand me, if you guys follow me. On the other hand, so this responsibility provided families during that time with a common struggle, which preoccupied them from the more trivial matters of married life that typically consume couples today. Married couples today become consumed with trivial issues. My rights, his rights. Trivial issues in the deen, and we allow that to consume us to the point where we end up in divorce. Meanwhile, we haven't, there's no collective struggle. There's no collective struggle. All right? So we are preoccupied with the trivial matters of married life, and they consume us rather than becoming preoccupied with a common goal, a common struggle. On the other hand, many families today within the larger framework of the Islamic community don't have a common focus, a common struggle that unites them, nor do they recognize a common enemy. They don't recognize a common enemy. There's no common struggle, there's no common focus, and there's no common enemy. There is individual focus, there's individual struggle, and there is individual enemies. I don't like this brother, I don't like that sister, I don't like that masjid, I don't like that community. That's individual. That's you personally. We're not looking at the community as a whole. And perhaps we're just a microcosm of the environments that we live in. It's a very individualistic society that we live in. And as American Muslims, we tend to become very individualistic as well. Our struggles is about our own personal individual struggle. Our focus is about our own individual focus. That's what it's about. Me as an individual. What I want, what I'm desiring, where I'm going. It's not us as a collective. All right? So on the other hand, many families today within the larger framework of the Islamic community don't have a common focus, a common struggle that unites them, nor do they recognize a common enemy other than themselves, who is determined to pick them off, and they don't recognize a common enemy other than themselves, who is determined to pick them off one by one until the entire family unit is divided. Shaitan realizes the power of divide and conquer and the strength of unity in numbers. Shaitan recognizes that. Shaitan knows the power that is in, divide and conquer. The concept of divide and conquer. Because that's exactly what he does. He separates you from your friend, you from your companion, you from your spouse, you from your children. Assalamu alaikum, akhi. Assalamu alaikum. That's $25. Those are not free. No, they're not.
I'm glad you know that.
Okay. That one is 25, the other one is 15. Okay, so Shaitan realizes the power that is in divide and conquer, and the strength that is in unity, right? The Prophet ﷺ said about this demonic tactic, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, 15. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, stick to the congregation, stick to the jama'ah, for indeed the wolf eats the sheep that strays on its own. That's divide and conquer. No, it's okay. It's okay. Likewise. Alhamdulillah. Can you ask one of the sisters downstairs if she has change? So the Prophet ﷺ, he said that stick to the jama'ah. Alaykum bil jama'ah. فإن الذئب يأكل من الغنم القاسية. The Prophet ﷺ said, stick to the congregation. Stick to the jama'ah. Huh? What about it? That was the book. Uh-huh. Yeah, the change for the 10. Okay. Okay. So the Prophet ﷺ says, stick to the jama'ah. Alaykum bil jama'ah. Stick to the congregation. فَإِنَّ الذِّئْبَ يَأْكُلُ مِنَ الْغَنَمِ الْقَاسِيَةِ. Stick to the congregation. Stick to the community. Stick to the jama'ah. For indeed the shaitan gets, or the wolf gets, the lone sheep. The sheep that strays by itself, the shaitan, the wolf is there to get it. So this was metaphorical for the fact of shaitan, for the fact that shaitan divides and conquers. He separates you from your spouse, and then before you know it, that same sister, off comes the hijab, off comes the khimar, and she's no longer practicing Muslim. Or the brother, same thing, he, divorces his wife, and then he goes down this long, dark path of, fornication, communicating with women in a haram fashion. This is divide and conquer, because when you guys were together, understand the power that is in a man and a woman being together. And all of what we see today of the, propagation of homosexuality and lesbianism and, queer and all of these other, concepts. These concepts are demonic in nature because they upset the natural order of man and woman and the power that lies in between a man and a woman being together. Understand how powerful it is for a husband and a wife, a man and a woman to unite. The power that is in that. Number one, they have the power to produce life by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thank you. Why come sit down? They have the power to produce life. When a man and a woman, unite in the bond of marriage, they have the power, by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to produce life. That within itself is powerful. A woman and a woman cannot produce life, and a man cannot produce life. The only thing that can produce life by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the unification of a man and a woman. Man and a woman together, they produce life. That is how powerful that relationship is. Not only do they produce physical life, but look at a woman who is happily married, a man that is happily married. That power, that energy transcends their relationship and begins to, manifest itself in other relationships, in work relationships. Look at how a man comes to work when he is happy at home. He comes to work and he does his job efficiently. He interacts with everybody in a healthy way. Same thing with a woman. When a woman is happy in her relationship, right? Look at the power that it produces beyond the home. She goes to work, she's happy, she interacts with people like a person who is happy and enjoying life, right? It doesn't matter what type of employment they have. It doesn't matter what type of job they have. But that is the power of two people being together, and that energy transcending just their normal relationship. Shaitan understands that power. Shaitan understands that power, so he does everything that he can to disrupt that power. Create separation, create dysfunction, create discord between, the spouses in the home. Shaitan understands that. And once he separates you, divide and conquer. He conquers you. Look at children when they are in a happy home, happy mother, happy father. Look at the type of children we produce. That's how powerful, these relationships are. We don't recognize that. We don't understand that. We look at marriage, we look at relationships as, this domain where I can get all of my personal needs met. My sexual needs, my financial needs, my emotional needs. I can get all of my needs met in this domain, in this institution that we call marriage, because we're so selfish. And that's the only way that's the way that we view marriage. Marriage is just a domain where we get our needs met. That's it. For no other reason. There's nothing else that we derive from that. Because we don't understand the power that is in the relationship between a man and a woman. Powerful. And Shaitan knows that. So he does everything in his power to disrupt that. And if families understood that, then they would do more to try to reconcile whatever their petty, trivial issues are, because they're looking at the bigger picture. Looking at the bigger picture. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala identifies Shaitan in the Quran as the chief enemy of man and his wife. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so we said, O Adam, indeed this one, Shaitan, is an enemy to you and your wife. So do not let him get you removed from paradise, so you will suffer. Consequently, when the husband and wife are not aware of the trickery of Shaitan, they begin to turn on one another. They begin to turn on one another, whereby viewing each other as the enemy, and their marriage as the battleground for spousal warfare. And in some instances, using their children as weapons. Using the children as weapons. And in the end, communities are left grappling with astronomical rates of divorce, while the real enemy, Shaitan, withdraws and then moves on to the next couple or the next family. You see how that works? See how that process works? Right? Yeah. Husband and wife begin to look at each other as the enemies. They begin to see their marriage as the battleground for spousal warfare. And in some instances, they begin to use their own children as, pawns, as ammunition, as weapons against one another. Allah musta'an. The Prophet ﷺ warned us that this is Shaitan's modus operandi. When he said, alayhi salatu wasalam, Iblis, Shaitan, places his throne upon water. And then he sends out detachments to create dissension amongst the people. The closest of the shayateen to Shaitan are those who are most notorious in creating dissension and separation between the children of Adam. One of the shayateen comes to Shaitan and he says, I did such and such. And Shaitan says, you have done nothing. You haven't done anything. Then another comes and he says, I did not spare so-and-so until I separated him from his wife. And then Shaitan embraces him saying, Ni'mata ant. You have done well. You have done well. So it's important for us to, as I talked about in the khutbah, to know our enemy and to know ourselves. So that was just one. I mentioned about 4 or 5 of the reasons why divorce was not prevalent amongst the early generation and why it is so prevalent amongst us. Now I'm going to skip to page number 30. And I want to talk about why divorce is so prevalent amongst us today. Why? Some of the more specific reasons that has led to the rise in divorce rates amongst American Muslims are number one, and I probably won't go past number 1. It's just way too much information. Number 1 is the culture and prevalence of NPD. Remember those letters. NPD. NPD. Narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder. And this is the culture that we live in. The culture and prevalence of narcissistic personality disorders that celebrates irresponsibility and liberation from the institution of marriage. A narcissistic personality disorder, the person concentrates solely on their needs and could totally care less and dismiss the needs of others. So the culture and prevalence of narcissistic personality disorders that celebrates irresponsibility and liberation from the institution of marriage. We live in a time where brothers and sisters search for loopholes within the institution of marriage in the form of trivial nitpicking that will allow them to be emotionally irresponsible or absent and invest very little of themselves in the relationship. So let's talk about that for a second. We live in an environment where many brothers and sisters... What? You have to stop, Mama. Here, drink your water. We live in an environment where many brothers and sisters, from the onset of the marriage, or even before they get married, they look for loopholes within the institution of marriage in the form of trivial nitpicking that will allow them or justify them to be emotionally unavailable or irresponsible and invest very little of themselves in the marriage. We do that even before we go into the marriage. We look for reasons to not invest emotionally in the institution of marriage, so that'll justify us being irresponsible, justify some of the actions that we do, some of the horrible interactions that go on between brothers and sisters within the marriage. And you're saying to yourself, why in the world did you even get married? If this was the way that you were going to conduct yourself, why even get married? So we tend to stand in our spaces of individuality, despite how unhealthy they are, unwilling to change, reluctant to do the work that is necessary for us to have a healthy relational experience with one another, and expect our spouses to meet us where we are. I'm not going to change. I am who I am. This is who he married. This is who she married. I don't care. I'm not changing myself for nobody. Then why are you even getting married? If you are not willing to, make some compromises, marriage is any relationship, not just marriage, any relationship is about compromise. Any relationship. It doesn't matter if it's a friendship. It doesn't matter if it's, kinship. Any relationship requires some level, some form of compromise. No one goes into a relationship with someone, believing that, no one should go into a relationship with anyone believing that they're not going to have to at some point make some compromises. That's not even rational thinking. That is irrational thinking, but this is what we do, right? So we tend to stand in our spaces of individuality. This is who I am, and I'm not changing myself for anyone. That's who I am. That's who you married. It's like, okay, that's who I married, but that's who you were when you were single. That's who you were before I married you. Once you get married, you are now in a zone, you're in a space, an intimate space with someone else. And if you want that space to be healthy, you have to be willing to make some compromises on both ends. But this whole idea of standing in your space of individuality, this is who I am, I'm not going to change myself for anybody, that's unrealistic. How in the world do you ever expect to have a healthy relationship with anybody with that type of mentality? That's a narcissistic personality disorder. So we tend to stand in our spaces of individuality, despite how unhealthy they are, unwilling to change. Reluctant to do the work that is necessary for us to have a healthy relational experience with one another, and expect the other person to meet us where we are. In addition, we issue ultimatums that place us in positions of power, all the while dismissing the sacrifices that are necessary for any relationship to be fruitful. We issue ultimatums, right? Just to put us in a position of power. An ultimatum is the ultimate role reversal. You issue an ultimatum when you reach a point where you feel like I am powerless. There's nothing I can do to change this person. So I'm going to issue an ultimatum. Either you change, either you do this, or I'm leaving. Either you do that or you're divorced. That puts you back in a power position. It's the ultimate role reversal. Consequently, we've become a microcosm of the larger environment in which we live. An environment that is morally and spiritually decaying as each day passes. Television shows that reinforce social irresponsibility, such as the Maury Show. Some of you guys still watch that show. Wallah al-Azim, I can say, alhamdulillah, I've never watched that show. Never watched one episode. I couldn't tell you anything and even knowing about this show, I had to go back and do some research about it myself. But I remember in prison, brothers used to sit in the day room and watch episode after episode after episode of this show, which is in essence exploitation of African Americans in specific and people in general, because it wasn't only African Americans on it. It's exploitation of people, not to mention exploitation of African Americans. Black exploitation at its best, just not being done by black people. The Maury Show, with its paternity test segments that absolve men of their paternal duties of not being the father, but does nothing to address or lessen the prevalence of promiscuity. Divorce parties, which are now a popular trend in American culture. In American culture today, people who get divorced, they have what's called divorce parties. Yeah. Divorce parties is now a popular trend within the fabric of American culture, where couples celebrate, sometimes together, their independence from one another and the termination of a union that was once the glue that kept families and communities together. So now we're celebrating the fact that we're divorced. We're now having divorce parties. That's how low we've sunken as American people, as Americans. I pray that this does not become a trend amongst the Muslims. I don't know this to be a trend amongst Muslims today. I've never heard of Muslims having divorce parties, but it is a very popular trend in American culture. Unfortunately, this phenomenon has made divorce just as appealing, if not more, than the process of marriage itself. It's almost like we look forward to getting divorced just as much, if not more, as we look forward to getting married. Just like you have one couple that are looking forward to their marriage, you have some people in their marriages that are waiting for the opportunity, waiting for the moment when they can separate themselves from this person. The narcissistic identity is fueled by the notion of complete independence from any and all forms of responsibility, and by default challenges the institution of marriage, a social construct that involves commitment and accountability, something that a narcissist cannot fathom, much less exercise. A narcissist cannot even fathom being, emotionally or responsible to somebody else, because a narcissist only concentrates on his or her needs. It's all about them. The conversation is about them. The emotional needs in the relationship is about them. Everything revolves around their needs. Which, that mentality within itself challenges the institution of marriage, because marriage is about what you give to the other person, not what you are receiving from the other person. You follow me? Marriage is not about what you are receiving from the other person. It's about what you are giving to the other person. All of the hadith that mention the Sahaba, all of the hadith that mention the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum coming to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to ask him about the rights of the marriage, they all mention the Sahaba asking the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about the rights of the other person. What is the rights? One of the Sahaba, the men, came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, Ya Rasulullah, ma haqqu zawjati ahdina alayna. O Messenger of Allah, what is the right of one of our wives over him? He didn't ask about his rights. He asked about the rights that he has to give the woman in the relationship. Because marriage is not about what you are receiving from the other person. It's about what you are giving to the other person. So the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum were more concerned about what they had to give to someone rather than what they were receiving from someone. So the narcissistic identity is fueled by the notion of complete independence from any and all forms of responsibility. I don't want to be responsible. I don't want to be emotionally responsible for somebody else. I don't want to be financially responsible for somebody else. Don't you got your own money? You make your own money, right? We don't want to be responsible for anybody else but ourselves, right? And by default, this mentality challenges the institution of marriage, a social construct that involves commitment and accountability, something that a narcissist cannot even fathom, much less exercise himself or herself. So that is one of the reasons why divorce is prevalent amongst us. I'm going to skip to number 4 for another reason why divorce is prevalent amongst us. Number 4 is the lack of social support for our marriages. In the Islamic community, we don't have social support for our marriages, whether family members or genuine friends who are willing to exhaust all of their efforts to see the couples remain together. Unfortunately, many of us go into relationships without considering all of the variables that will ensure a healthy and longevous marriage. When we marry into a Muslim family that is replete with siblings who are also in healthy, successful marriages, the couple is more likely to stay in the relationship because there is no premise of divorce in the family unit. When brothers and sisters marry into families, you marry a sister, she has a mother and a father who are married, she has sisters that are married, she has a brother who's married. When you marry into a family like that, you're more likely to stay and work your relationship out because there is no premise of divorce in that family unit. Everybody in the family is happily married. They have their problems, they have their issues, but there is no premise of divorce in that family unit. So when you marry into a family like that, you're more likely to work your problems out, work your issues out, because you see that divorce is not something that is prevalent in this particular family unit. And if I divorce this woman, or if this woman asks for a divorce, it's going to be frowned upon. There's going to be an embarrassment that is associated with that. So couples are more likely to work their issues out. But when we have families that are broken, by divorce, families that are broken by divorce, families that are broken by separation, then it's a premise there. So it's like, okay, well, her sister has been divorced. Her brother is working on his 3rd or 4th marriage. The mom is divorced from the father. So it's like divorce is already, a factor in that family unit. So you're less likely to stay and work the situation out. You may have some brothers that'll say, I'm going to stay because I don't want my wife to end up like that. But they are a minority. Those situations are a minority. So a lack of support, social support, whether family members or genuine friends who are willing to see the marriage all the way through. When family members are involved. You giving your own lecture? When family members are involved, then there is a sense of familial responsibility for the couple to work through their issues rather than run away from them. When the family members are involved in the marriage, all right, there's a family responsibility. Families start to feel like they are responsible to make sure that this marriage works. There's a sense of responsibility that the family has. When Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu sought permission to enter the Prophet's home and found his daughter Aisha radiallahu anha raising her voice over the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's voice, he was astonished and infuriated. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu one day was walking by the Prophet's house and he could overhear his daughter shouting at her husband. He could overhear Aisha shouting at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he became infuriated. This is my daughter raising her voice at her husband. And so he asked the Prophet ﷺ for permission to enter. He moved closer to Aisha in order to grab her physically. But the Prophet ﷺ intervened, saving her from Abu Bakr's grip. So Abu Bakr was going to grab Aisha, and the Prophet ﷺ jumped in between them, saving his wife. Abu Bakr, resorted to verbally reprimanding her, saying, "Are you raising your voice over the voice of the Messenger of Allah?" Abu Bakr had a sense of responsibility to preserve his daughter's marriage, which caused him to intervene. Some parents just sit back and watch the marriage dissolve right in front of them. simply because they didn't want her to be married to him anyway, or they didn't want their son being married to this woman anyway. So when they see that the couple is having problems in their marriage, they sit back, sakitun, say absolutely nothing, because they actually want the marriage to dissolve. Sad, man. This is the type of environment that we live in. Because the mother didn't want her daughter to be married to this brother anyway. The mother didn't want this brother to be married to her daughter anyway. So she helps to sabotage the situation by not intervening when she had the ability to do so. Likewise with the brother. The brother may be close to his mother. And in a lot of the foreign communities, you find a lot of the brothers, their relationship with their mothers, their relationship with their wives is just an extension of their relationship with their mothers. Their wives become extensions of their mothers. That relationship that they have with their mothers continues on with the relationship with the wife. So what happens sometimes is that the mother doesn't want her son being married to this particular woman. So when she sees that they are having problems, and the problems are inevitable, she sees that they're having problems in their marriage, she just sits back and says nothing. As a matter of fact, she may even give some innuendos to her son that this woman is not for you. See, I told you shouldn't even marry her. As if to say that having marital problems is a justification for not being married to someone. Everybody has marital problems. Marital problems are systemic across religious, financial, economic stability, and as well as cultural lines. It doesn't matter how economically stable you are. It doesn't matter how financially stable you are. Doesn't matter how religious you are. Doesn't matter how knowledgeable you are. Marital problems are inevitable. Marital problems are inevitable. How can I help you? I'm showing you guys too much attention. How can I help you? So, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he felt inclined to intervene. This was his daughter raising her voice over her husband. And so he intervened. There was a sense of responsibility to intervene. It is this type of social and familial concern that can help to reduce the frustration that tends to overwhelm young couples when they don't have an outlet today. On one occasion, the Prophet ﷺ entered the house of his daughter, Fatima, and inquired as to where her husband was. And she replied, "Kana baynana shay," that we had an argument, and he left. So the Prophet ﷺ sent someone to go look for Ali, only to find him asleep in the masjid. Dirt from the afternoon sandstorm collected on the back of Ali, and when the Prophet ﷺ went to get him, he wiped the dirt off of his back, saying, "Kum ya Aba Turab, kum ya Aba Turab, get up, O Abu Turab, get up." So you can see that the Prophet ﷺ intervened in the relationship between his daughter and her husband. So inshallah ta'ala, we'll pause here while they call the adhan, inshallah ta'ala, and then I'll take a couple of minutes for questions and answers, bi'idhnillah. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira. Put your shirt down. Don't you want the shirt? Just,